I'll tell you something that we did recently, and you can tell me what you think about it. It's analogous. We were trying to study political correctness. And so the first thing we were trying to figure out was, is there even such a thing? Because if you look at the political dialogue, what you find is that people on the side of the political spectrum who have been defined as politically correct tend to say that it doesn't exist, and that category is just a pejorative term that was invented by people who hold alternative political opinions. And so the first question is, well, what do you mean does it exist? What do you mean by exist? How do you tell if a psychological concept is real? Like, is anger something that exists objectively? Is it an objective phenomena? Well, it's not that easy to determine. You say, well, we act like it is, and we understand what anger means, but no one goes around in the world and says anger, without saying anything else, or you'd run away from them. What they do is they place the word anger into a sentence and place the sentence within a conversation, and they enable you to infer exactly what they mean by the word anger by listening to the surrounding context, right? And if you're going to turn that into something like an objective term, what you do is you pull out the term anger, and then you make the hypothesis that it represents something real in the objective world. But it's not that easy to determine if something does exist, especially if it's a psychological phenomena, in the real world. What do you mean by exist? That's the problem of construct validation, okay? So that's another term you really need to know if you're interested in experimental psychology, especially on the personality end. A construct is a representation of something psychological that hypothetically exists objectively. How do you establish its existence objectively? Well, does fear exist? No, you have the problem with all the emotional terms. Does joy exist? Does surprise exist? Does embarrassment exist? Does guilt exist? Shame? How are they related to one another? Guilt and shame, for example, seem quite similar to one another, right? And pain and fear and anger all seem to share the attribute of unpleasant and negative emotions. And so if something exists, it should be the same as some things and different from other things. And that's part of construct validation as well, to specify how the construct is the same as some things and different from others. Anger should be reliably distinguishable from joy, for example, because otherwise they're not different. And anger and fear should be somewhat the same if they're both negative emotions. And so it's extraordinarily complex to validate a construct. And so here's what we did with political correctness. And the reason I'm using the political examples is because that's an obvious place where self-serving bias can enter the scientific arena, right? So if I wanted to make a point about political correctness, or if I wanted to make a point about right-wing fascism, I could build my biases into the measurement instruments accidentally, and then they would produce as output what I put into them as input. And I want to protect myself against that if I actually want to do the scientific investigation properly. So what we did when we started to construct our measures of political correctness was employ a number of people to go through as many news sources as they could get their hands on to identify any attitude or behavior, roughly that had been described by anyone at all as potentially politically correct. So it was kind of agnostic. And we were trying to do it as randomly as possible, to get as many news sources as we possibly could, so that we were sampling across the environment without bias. Okay, so then we came up with, I don't remember how many, couple hundred, maybe more, couple hundred items that were roughly indicative of what you might describe as political correctness. But that's not good enough, right? Because just because you have this random assemblage of items doesn't indicate at all that they're all measuring something that was similar. Right? That's just implicit. They're all called political correctness, but you don't know if those attitudes co-vary. And what that means is, if you held one attitude of that list, were you more likely to hold another or multiple others, right? So does the conditional probability of holding multiple items, is there a high probability of holding true multiple items simultaneously? Well, you figure that out with factor analysis. So what we did is we turned that into a questionnaire using different question types, and we administered it to several hundred people, and we did a factor analysis, and we found actually that there was such a thing as political correctness because the questions clumped together. People would reliably answer them in a patterned manner, but that there were actually two dimensions that were quite separate. So there isn't one political correctness, there seems to be two. And then we looked at the personality predictors and the IQ predictors and a variety of other predictors that would enable us to come to some understanding of the temperamental proclivity towards those political attitudes, if any. We knew already that political conservatives tended to be low in trait openness, that's the creativity dimension, and high in trait conscientiousness. Whereas political liberals tended to be high in trait openness and low in conscientiousness. And so one of the things that's extraordinarily interesting to know from a Big Five perspective is that your political proclivities are very powerfully influenced by your temperament. And so one of the things you can think about with regards to ongoing political discussions in the real world is that those discussions are actually attempts by people of different temperaments, one, to impose their temperamental viewpoints on the world, and two, to engage in a dialogue with people who are actually quite different than they are. So like conscientious people, like they value hard work, rules, order, reliability, integrity, and structure. And so they're dutiful. We analyzed what predicted military performance, for example, in the US Army. Overwhelmingly conscientiousness. It's not surprising, right? Because it's a very structured, rule-ordered, top-down, follow procedure sort of endeavor. Now, the armed forces had problems with that to some degree because they were also simultaneously looking for people who could think independently on their feet. Because if you're in a battlefield, for example, especially if you're isolated from your command structure, there's going to be times when you have to make extraordinarily difficult decisions on your own. But if you're selected primarily for conscientiousness, that's not going to be your forte, because if you're a conscientious person, what happens is that you enter into a contract with someone, even yourself, and then you carry it out. So now we've also spent a lot of time selecting entrepreneurs. I work with this company in California that has started schools for entrepreneurs in 160 different countries all over the world. The guy who started this, whose name is Adeo Resi, he's an absolute monster. The guy started, he started all those schools in 5 years, 165 schools in all across the world, 8 different languages. And we've been screening people for entrepreneurial ability. And if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you almost have the opposite profile as a soldier. You're very high in openness and you're lower in conscientiousness, or at least conscientiousness is irrelevant. And the reason for that seems to be that, like, if you're an orderly person and you like to follow procedures and rules, it's kind of hard for you to start a company, because when you first start a company or engage in any other creative process, because entrepreneurs turn out to be the same as artists, you kind of have to, you're not operating within a rule-governed structure. In fact, there may be many times where you have to break a small rule to move properly at a higher level of analysis. There's no algorithmic way of generating a new company, right? Obviously. And so it's people who are very high in openness who happen to be good entrepreneurs. And so this is something I thought was extraordinarily cool, because we'd also already known what predicts managerial, administrative, and academic ability. And IQ is crucial for any complex job, so we'll just leave that behind. But what predicts academic ability, for example, at the University of Toronto, is intelligence, obviously, but also conscientiousness. The correlation between creativity and grades at the U of T is 0. Right. But it's not surprising. The thing is, it's easy to be cynical about that, but one of the things you have to understand about creative people is that they continually step outside of the domain of evaluation structures. Right? Because if you're going to say you're going to evaluate the performance of 100 professors on their lecturing ability, well, you kind of have to measure what's common across all the professors in order to come up with the standards for evaluation. Well, that means you're not going to be able to use that structure to evaluate a particularly creative professor, because he or she is going to do something in a way that's so different that it won't show up on the evaluation measure. And of course, that's what happens in universities, Somebody sent me, a couple of days ago, somebody sent me an essay that they had written for their master's thesis that was wildly creative, and they were basically told to leave the program and that they couldn't continue. Not in a mean way. What happened was that what they were thinking was so outside of the conventions in the discipline is that no one had any idea what to do with the essay. So and that's really the lot of creative people, right? They're always stepping outside of evaluation structures. And so it's not that surprising that the relationship between creativity and grades at the U of T is 0. We found out as well by looking at graduate student performance across multiple institutions that there was a negative correlation between creativity and graduate school performance. It wasn't even 0, it was worse than negative. Being creative was negative. And you think, well, that could make you cynical as well, but you can't be cynical in that way, because one of the things that happens in science is that science tends to progress incrementally rather than in great leaps. Now and then someone comes along who blows the structure out of a science and advances it ridiculously, like Einstein. But like, most people aren't Einstein, and maybe thank God for that. Most of the time, you're in a discipline, you understand the discipline, and then once you've developed understanding of the discipline, you know what the next micro question is that should be answered. And part of the reason that science is so powerful is because it allows people who aren't genius level creatives to make real advances in the generation of knowledge, one tiny micro step at a time. It doesn't matter if there's 100,000 people doing it and each of them is making a micro step, man. We're zipping along as fast as we possibly want to zip along. And so it turns out to be conscientiousness that's the excellent predictor of graduate student performance. That's the best predictor for law. It's the best predictor for managerial positions. It's the best predictor for administrative positions. Anything that has a structure of rules that needs to be applied, conscientiousness is a great predictor. So, but it's not good for predicting artistic ability or entrepreneurial ability. And that's also really important, because one of the things, this is partly why bureaucracies stultify, right? Because what happens is as they develop, they get chock full of conscientious people, with a few psychopaths thrown in there just for good measure. They get chock full of conscientious people busily zooming efficiently down a single track, and then all of a sudden the landscape shifts and they're going very, very efficiently in exactly the wrong direction, and then the whole bloody thing falls apart. So you need to have some creative wingnuts in your organization to come up with completely absurd ideas that might just on the off chance be true. And so creativity is strange in that manner too, because it's a high risk, high return game. You're a lot safer in your life to find a functioning entity and to operate as a cog within it, as long as the entity keeps functioning. Because if you're creative and you go off on tangents all the time, there's some probability that one of those tangents is going to be exactly what is needed at the time, and you're going to become hyper successful as a consequence. But there's much more probability that even though some of your ideas might be highly valuable, the probability that this is the right time and place for them is extraordinarily low. So to produce a successful creative product, for example, in the marketplace, you need a ridiculous combination of creativity so that you keep generating ideas, and then a network around you of people who have skills that you don't, and then the production of a product, let's say, whatever that happens to be, that's actually in demand by the marketplace at exactly that moment, and that someone else hasn't already done better. So the sensible thing to tell anybody who wants to be creative is, that's stupid. You shouldn't do it. It's your probability of success is so low that it's better just to do something sensible. But the problem with that is that creative people can't do that because they're creative. And if they shut down their creativity, it's like an extrovert who's gone to live in in an isolated cell. A creative person who isn't being creative, they just wither and die. So they're stuck with it. But it is a high risk, high return strategy. So probably better if you want to be creative, or if you are, and you should take this advice to heart, because I've been watching people for a long time. If you want to engage in a creative pursuit, you should find something stable to do that will generate you an income, and you should pursue the thing that you're creative about on the side, because monetizing creative production is so bloody difficult that, especially now, especially in artistic domains, generation of music and that sort of thing, is like you just have no idea how many million songs there are on the internet. And the vast majority of them, commercially available, get downloaded 0 times. I think there's 80 million songs or something like that on the net. And I believe it's something in the neighborhood of 70 million get downloaded 0 times. And then there's 100 that get downloaded 350 million times. And so those people are wildly successful and everyone else collapses in failure. Yep.